We saw the world change and we saw the world open up, and that world is closing again. It's closing again.
Welcome to the Block and Tackle Show, hosted by Carl Block. He'll be tackling some of the biggest issues in business today. Welcome to the show.
I've had a number of guests say, even if you believe that with technology and drones, you can have less naval ships and still win a conflict, you still need commercial vessels to get goods to the United States and to our trading partners. So I hope we will break through all that stuff and get it done. And now turning to more of the cyber thing that you talked about before, because you are on the board of Six Star Capital. This seems like on multiple levels. You talked about disinformation, but also, it's publicly available information about what was happening with that telecom network in New York around the United Nations, efforts by an actor to hack into the grid, an energy company, and other government servers. What can we do to protect from these attacks? And also, because the next step is you cannot just disrupt, you can use our own technology to put out disinformation. So where do you see some of that going?
It's a lot of questions.
I know.
I mean, for one thing, it is always incumbent upon people forget we do have our governors are very powerful. Our governors are very powerful from an economic standpoint because they can make trade agreements, but our governors are also very powerful from the standpoint that they do control so much of what happens within their state. And so it has to be a good relationship between the governors and the president of the United States and the cabinet for things like infrastructure protection, right? It's not just one or the other. And I think we've lost the thread on that a little bit. I mean, if we've lost the thread about the importance of protecting those government buildings because there's been an anti-government push in certain cities, but secondarily is you are going to have to constantly be working with the governors and talking about wargaming. And I've talked to the governors about this. The governors need to wargame, right? They do. They need to wargame. They need to wargame a little bit more than they are, particularly as it is relates to what could happen in my state. Where can things go wrong? Because if we have a major attack where multiple different systems are being impacted, particularly large metropolitan areas, then the governors sure as heck should have wargamed out, if these systems break down, how do I get food to people? How do I get medicine to people? How do I take care of protecting the infrastructures that I have? And so they are always the missing component in these broader conversations we have, but they're probably some of our most important people that we need to have involved. And with misinformation and things, looking at what's going on in their school districts and others to ensure that they have that we're pushing down knowledge to a level that the governors are actually keeping an eye out for it.
Was a great answer. I mean, all of your answers have been amazing, frankly, but I would say this to you, just as you spoke about with businesses, that a lot of them look quarter to quarter. Sadly, I think there's a lot of governors who say, okay, well, I could spend money upgrading the grid, but is that going to get me votes? I could spend money on infrastructure that certain people who are going to build the infrastructure or maintain it are going to benefit by. But the person who's going to vote in the next 2-year cycle isn't going to think about that. And so if I have to feed, if I have to clothe, if I have to do this, hey, FEMA will take care of my problems. And that's sort of a fear that I have, that they're not listening to you and that they're not thinking about this.
Yeah, I mean, we've got some very good governors. We do. We have a lot of business people. I don't think people unless you, like I do, interact with the governors, you realize that so many of our governors right now are people who started businesses. They're multimillionaires because, you had Governor Stitt was Gateway, and you have Governor Ricketts, who then became Senator Ricketts, whose family is obviously very wealthy. But we have a lot of governors who have business experience. Doug Burgum, one reason he was a strong governor and makes a stronger cabinet member is that he was a business person. He built a software and he sold it to Microsoft, and then he was working there for a period of time. So we have governors who do think about this. I think Governor DeSantis has probably led the way of demonstrating that a state can be fairly self-contained. He's probably done the most, not to be political, but just if you look at what he did after the last hurricane and the degree to which a bridge was destroyed and it was back up in 3 days. that was all handled by the state. So states do have the capacity to, and he also does a great deal in the area of misinformation and checking on foreign investments within his state and what those foreign investments are trying to do in his state. But they need to be, the governors, it's incumbent upon them to do a lot of this work.
That makes sense. Being on the left coast, I sometimes wonder how some of our governors are doing with that, and they're certainly not publicizing it. But your points are obviously very well taken. So because you've done so many things, now I guess I get to talk to you about health and obesity and the work you've done with food. Tell us about what you've got going on there and what you think about what ideas there are out there to end obesity, reduce, chronic, comorbidities based upon what we're doing with food.
I don't think it's all food. So I would start there. I ran the Healthy Weight Commitment Foundation, was a public-private partnership that I started on behalf of the food and beverage companies, and we made the first commitment to Michelle Obama as part of the Let's Move campaign. And the Obama White House was very keen on ensuring that we reduced sugars and fats, but when we attempted to do so in a regulated way or a standardized way, we quickly ran into issues because not all food is made the same way. And some of that food is governed by a variety of different regulations in the United States and overseas that make it impossible for the companies to reformulate in exactly the same fashion. Plus, you wouldn't have food taste the way, nor would it be inexpensive enough. So we, after a great deal of conversation and we were working with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is one of the largest foundations in the world, multi-billion-dollar foundation focused on health and wellness with obesity at the forefront. The agreement was that the companies would reduce calories in the marketplace. And we made a commitment to reduce calories in the marketplace, but we allowed each of the companies to make those reductions in the way that made the most sense for their products, right? So products have to meet taste, value, and convenience. That's what consumers want. So every company is designing a product to make sure it tastes good, that it's of value, i.e. they can afford it, and it's convenient. It's easy for them to consume or to gain access to at all levels. We ultimately, because we had these fierce competitors, we had Pepsi and Coke and General Mills and Kellogg, we had all the biggest competitors in the world, Nestle, Kraft, running the same race. They didn't know what each other had committed to. All they knew is that everybody as a whole had agreed to commit to reducing 1.5 trillion calories. We set a 5-year goal, and in 3 years, we actually beat that goal by 400%. Because we allowed competition to be the defining mechanism, the companies were competing against their fiercest competitors. They wanted to get over the finish line first. And so we reduced 6.4 trillion calories in 3 years. By doing calories, we were able to reduce sugars and fats. There's an assumption that we have not reformulated food in the United States. Food has been reformulated quite a bit in the United States, dating back to the 1990s. There was already a huge transition that went on that took sugar out of the marketplace. We've had stevia, monk fruit. So when people focus just on food as the underlying cause of the rise of disease, I don't necessarily agree with that. I think it's a factor, but I think it's one of multiple factors that are out there.
Okay. Do you think we're continuing to head in the right direction?
I think that we underestimate the variety of choices the American consumer has. Currently, some of those choices, like allergen-free products, will cost 3 times more than your regular products. So an example would be if you're buying a gluten-free pasta because you have celiac disease or you have a wheat allergy, which would cause you to go into anaphylaxis and die, you have to pay 3 times more than you and I might if we're just buying a regular box of pasta. If we can help, there are a lot of better for you products that are out there that have much more expensive ingredients. And so I think part of the process needs to be an economic one. It's not where we beat everybody up and say you have to make food better. It's also driving competition by removing barriers for small and medium-sized companies to compete and provide alternative products. Here's a perfect example. Baby food is the hardest. It is the hardest market to get into because of a variety of regulations that are there. Yet there are a lot of entrepreneurial companies and there are a lot of wealthy people in the United States who are buying very, very expensive baby foods because they can afford to do it. So the question might be, how do we give competition a break where everybody's competing at the same level? We can drive down the prices of these better for you component parts of each of the products and help them discover ways that they can do broader manufacturing so that they're also reducing cost as they're producing more.
Get that done. I hope you have a seat at the table as it's happening. Let's talk a little bit about what we talked about in your intro, women in senior leadership positions. You're obviously a pioneer. You pulled a rabbit out of a hat with the World Expo, and I guess you've been just moving forward about helping women get into diplomacy and senior leadership roles. Tell us about it.
So the world has changed a lot since I started, and I always have to remind younger women of that. When I got going, I was a 21-year-old at the Pentagon as the youngest political appointee at the Pentagon. My nickname was Tinkerbell. I weighed 95 pounds. I have this very funny picture that I show at the beginning of little tiny Lisa surrounded by all these generals, and I always just kept moving. I never gave up. If somebody told me I couldn't do something, then I'd figure out another way I could do it. I was not a rule breaker. I was a rule follower. But I learned that if you keep moving forward, if you speak with facts, if you take the time to do the research in advance of the meeting, which most people do not do, that you can sit in a meeting where you've actually prepared, you wait for the opportunity, and you throw out fact-based information that sort of startles the room, right? Because you did your homework. The work that I've been involved with the most is not only helping young women identify their opportunities in some fairly technical fields in medicine and in high tech, in the energy industry, and giving them the peer groups that would allow them to have that exchange of information in a private way so that they could continue to advance their degrees, and being very open and transparent about this is what you need in order to do this, and giving them answers, right? You learn from people who are like you. You learn from people when you rise up. You learn when other women pull you up the ladder. And the people who went before me, some of them pulled us up the ladder. Other people were like, well, I've worked really, really hard and gosh darn it, I'm going to be the one on top and you aren't. That's changed. You have a lot more women in power positions today. And even globally, people underestimate. When I look at the Balkans, and I spent a lot of time with the Balkan countries, Maya Sandu is president of Moldova. You have women in every single major office in Lithuania. In Poland, you have a lot of women. So what's interesting is some of the countries who are newer to the EU or newer to the NATO or the European construct, they actually have more women who are in senior level positions. It's some of the more traditional and older countries where you find the resistance. And so I'm happy to see that the work that we've done to give women a voice, to help them run for office around the world, we're seeing success from that, but it does require people making way for someone else. That's always important.
So first, from what my experience is, you aren't kidding that some of the most developed countries make the path for women to be elevated very, very difficult. And literally 10 days ago, I was talking to somebody overseas from one of those countries who said to me, yep, it's still an old boys club, Carl. It's still an old boys club. And you don't see women at senior leadership levels, either in the government or in our country's, not the United States, but her country's largest companies. And I don't get it. I don't understand. I don't know why people think that I don't even know why anybody would think, wait, it is really conceivable and actually happens that a woman is the best person for the job. And why are we holding them back? The other thing, of course, is I do hear from women that they wish they had more women mentors. And a lot of women will say, I end up being in more trusting relationships with male mentors than female mentors, precisely for the reason that you said. You have pioneer women who say, I had to put up with all the shenanigans from men, and you have to be tested in the fire. I'm not going to make things easy for you. I mean, everybody is entitled to their own philosophy. I just don't know that that necessarily helps.
I would also say one thing, if you look at European countries, that the reason why you may also see that challenge is they're very bureaucratic and they're traditionally bureaucratic. And there is nothing you can use against somebody more and their rise to the top than bureaucracy. Because it requires checking boxes. It requires checking bureaucratic boxes. You even see that in academia. And so people in some of the more nimble countries where it's about survival tend to be less bureaucratic, which then opens the door for somebody who's really smart to be pulled in and go, okay, solve this problem now. I saw it when different companies. It was always interesting working with 16 CEOs at the same time because I had such insight into how their companies operated.
Some people would say that in our world, there are many, many countries where they have leaders, but maybe they're linos. They're leaders in name only, but they're really not leaders. What would you say, based upon all the work you've done with CEOs and the turnarounds, what is the most important leadership trait that you would suggest to somebody? This is what you need if you want to be a great leader.
You have to be willing to make the sacrifices. Some people get into leadership positions and they run around on their private jets and they stay behind their little glass walls and their locked doors and they don't walk the halls. And the greatest leaders that I have worked with are those individuals who walk the hallways, go down to the lunchroom, take people out for lunch. They don't sequester themselves. And we're missing that today. And you learn so much when you're walking. I remember when Andy Grove and Intel, the executive offices were on the 7th floor. It was always actually a pain when he'd go, well, let's walk up. It's like, that's 7 floors. Let me take my shoes off. But do I remember it? Absolutely. I remember every moment I had to walk in a stairwell with Andy Grove. I may have been gasping at the end as he was asking me questions, but how much more personal could it get than that? So I think walking the floor is one thing. The other is don't go for the cookie cutter approach. My background is highly unusual. And if I were being hired based on a cookie cutter approach, I would never get hired. My dad taught me, he was always very good. He didn't like new shiny pennies. They drove him nuts. And when everybody went after the new shiny penny as an executive, he would be the person saying, there's this guy over here who has this talent that we're really going to need in 5 years. And that other stuff about that guy that you may not, he may not be the best dressed. He may not be the most eloquent. He may not present himself the best to meetings. I can fix that. But what I can't do is I can't give those guys who do look the best dressed, who do have the eloquence, I actually can't give them the special super skill set that he has that I need 5 years from now. So that would be the other piece. And the two go together, right? There's a lot of ego and there's this tendency. I mean, how many times have we seen executives show up with their entourage? Get rid of the entourages, walk the floor, and look for the people who have the special talents that you need to be successful 5 years down the road.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think I've seen myself that best leaders do know how to listen. They do know how to engage with people. They don't act like they're the smartest person in the room, and they like people around them that don't act like they're the smartest people in the room or the slickest or the best looking or whatever, but they collaborate. So I appreciate that. So I've got two more questions for you. One is, you have really been in the thick of things. And I mean, sometimes your turnarounds must seem daunting, but when times really get tough, and this question really is directed for a lot of business people who might be struggling, who may not have overcome nearly the challenges you have. When times get tough, what does keep you on track?
I am a person of great faith, so I do pray a lot. And there are times where I'm like praying the entire way up the highway as I'm driving at 5 o'clock in the morning. Okay, God, this is really, I know that you've got this whole thing about we can only bear so much and I don't, and that you should be able to overcome it. Well, here's the test. But I do shuttle diplomacy. I find that if I can bring people to my side to run up the hill with me and give things a chance to be successful, that I am better off. And so what I will do in a very tough situation is I go and I meet with people at their desks, and it doesn't matter what level they are. But maybe it's the investors, maybe it's the customer, but I spend an inordinate amount of time doing shuttle diplomacy. And I'll go and I'll sit down with the people who are the biggest voices and say, this is what the problem is. And I give them a quantitative reason. If we do this, which is what you want me to do, this is how that problem is going to quantitatively grow. If you allow me to try this new path, I am guaranteeing that if I understand your pain point, I will make sure that I am keeping that in mind as I am making my decisions. And I think the one thing anyone who hires me will say is that I end up bringing a crowd to the solution because I've convinced them all that we have got to do something different than we're doing it. And when you do that, it's the same way as running up a hill, right? If you've got everybody and you've got everybody who's finally coming together, and maybe they're not happy, but they trust you because you've been really honest with them, and you find yourself going up through the clouds towards, wondering if you're ever going to hit the sunlight in that peak. When you get there, it's so much more fun.
That's a great answer. Okay, so my last question for you, since you've done so many things, and if you don't want to tell me, because a lot of people are going to watch this, it's fine. But if you do want to tell me, what's the next great thing that you want to target?
I have dedicated myself around women in democracy and being that mentor to women who are running for office or who are fighting in foreign militaries or fighting in the US military, who are trying to be successful in stitching the pieces together so that we can identify the best and the brightest to solve the big problems that will enable us to retain the world that Ronald Reagan opened to us. What I worry about is, when I was in my career, 40% of the world was under communism. And at that point, after the wall fell, we saw the world change and we saw the world open up, and that world is closing again. It's closing again. I remember when I couldn't travel to different countries. That's happening again. I wouldn't feel very comfortable going to China or Russia right now. I know I could, definitely couldn't go to Iran. But if you think about after the wall came down, the whole world opened up. We could go everywhere where we hadn't been able to travel before. And we could run really, really fast. And if I can help those women run as fast as they can in order to retain the ability of people to keep that dream alive, to keep the dream of self-determination alive within their country, that's what I want to do.
What a great closing answer. Okay, so Lisa, I've really appreciated you sharing your time with us, and there's so much wisdom that you've given us. For our viewers and listeners, if you have questions, you can email me at carl@blockandtackleshow.com. If you have questions for me, I'll respond. If they're questions for Lisa, I'll forward your questions to her. She's a great communicator, as you all can see. I'm sure she'll give you great responses. And I really, really, really appreciate you coming on the show today, Lisa. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Carl Block is both a corporate lawyer and a corporate restructuring partner. Nothing in the podcast should be construed as legal advice.
If you want more info on the show, please visit blockandtackleshow.com. And you can also email me at carl@blockandtackleshow.com. Thanks for tuning in.